Did you know that 1 in 20 people sitting behind bars might be innocent? Think about that. For every 20 cells, one holds someone who didn't do it. Someone who wakes up every morning knowing the world got it wrong. They eat, sleep, and dream inside a place built for the guilty. And no matter how loudly they speak, no one believes them anymore. In 2002, one of those people was a young woman named Sarah Jo Pender. She was 22 years old, barely out of college, still trying to figure out who she wanted to be, when a judge told her she would spend the rest of her life behind bars. The courtroom fell silent. A life ended that day, though she was still breathing. Sarah wasn't a career criminal. She wasn't a mastermind or a monster, but that's exactly what the system decided she was. They called her manipulative. They called her cold. They called her the female Charles Manson. In a matter of weeks, the world believed it. The truth, though, the real story, is much darker, much quieter, and far more tragic. Because it wasn't built on evidence, it was built on lies. Before the headlines, before the label, before the 110 years, there was just a young woman trying to survive. She grew up in a small Indiana town. She was bright, social, and full of potential. She dreamed of going to college, building a life, maybe starting a family one day. But life doesn't always unfold the way we plan it. By 21, Sarah was working as a secretary, trying to save money, still figuring out adulthood. She met Richard Hull, a bouncer with a rough edge, older, louder, the kind of man who seemed confident enough to fill any room. To Sarah, who was shy and eager to please, he looked like protection. To everyone else, he looked like danger. Love is a strange thing. It doesn't always arrive like a storm. Sometimes it sneaks in quietly, like smoke. You don't realize you're surrounded until you can't breathe. With Richard, that smoke thickened fast. He was controlling, possessive. But Sarah didn't see the warning signs. Or maybe she did, and chose to ignore them, hoping love could fix what fear couldn't. By late 2000, she moved into a small house on Michael Street in Indianapolis. It wasn't much. Just a simple, run-down home, but for Sarah, it was a step toward independence. She didn't know that house would one day become a crime scene that would change her life forever. Inside that house lived two other people, Andrew Cataldi and Tricia Nordman. Both were fugitives from Nevada, running from drug and forgery charges. Together with Richard, they were running a small drug operation, not big enough to make headlines, but dangerous enough to attract trouble. The house became chaotic, filled with tension and paranoia. Arguments flared over money, over drugs, over loyalty. And Sarah, caught in the middle, became the quiet peacekeeper, trying to hold together something that was already falling apart. But love can blind you to the truth. And by the fall of 2000, everything in that house was about to spiral out of control. It started with one decision, a single choice that would destroy everything. On the morning of October 24th, 2000, Sarah and Richard went to Walmart. Richard wanted a gun. He couldn't buy one himself. He was a convicted felon. So Sarah did it for him. It was a small thing at the time, a favor, a moment of trust. She bought the shotgun. He picked out the shells. She had no idea she was holding the weapon that would later be used to kill two people and sentence her to a lifetime behind bars. That evening, Sarah had dinner with her parents. They talked about work, family, ordinary things. There was nothing unusual. Nothing that hinted that by morning, everything would be gone. She went home around 11 p.m. What happened after that depends on who you ask. According to Sarah, an argument broke out between Richard and Andrew. She stepped outside to get some air, to walk it off. When she came back, the house was silent. Too silent. Inside, she found blood. Everywhere. Richard had taken the shotgun, the same one she'd bought earlier that day, and shot both Andrew and Tricia. 2 young lives ended in seconds. And Sarah, terrified and in shock, froze. Later she said, "I didn't call the police. I stayed with him out of love, fear, loyalty, and sheer stupidity." In the hours that followed, she and Richard tried to erase what had happened. They borrowed a carpet cleaner from a neighbor. They scrubbed. They lifted. They loaded the bodies into a truck. Somewhere before sunrise, they dumped them into a dumpster behind a building a few blocks away. Then they went home. By morning, the house smelled of bleach and silence. Sarah went to work, trying to pretend everything was normal. But normal had died hours ago. The next day, October 25th, the bodies were found. Police followed the trail back to Michael Street. The house was half cleaned, but not enough. Evidence of violence clung to the walls, the floor, the carpet. Within days, both Sarah and Richard were arrested. Richard confessed almost immediately. He admitted to shooting both victims. From there, he even described the weapon. He was the killer, clear, direct, certain. Sarah turned over a pair of blood-stained pants, Richard's pants, as evidence. The blood matched the victims. To anyone looking at the facts, the case was over. The shooter confessed. The weapon matched. There was no mystery left. But justice doesn't always want the truth. Sometimes it wants a story. And prosecutors were about to tell one. A story that would turn a frightened young woman into the devil herself. They wanted headlines. They wanted a villain. They wanted a name people would remember. And they found it in Sarah Jo Pender. By the end of that week, a new narrative was born. Sarah wasn't a victim. She wasn't even a bystander. She was the mastermind. The theory was simple, seductive, and impossible to resist. That Sarah had manipulated her boyfriend into committing murder. That she had orchestrated everything. Behind the scenes, pulling the strings like some criminal puppeteer. It was fiction. But fiction sells better than truth. The press ate it up. And when Sarah's mugshot appeared next to the headline, "The Female Charles Manson," her fate was sealed. It didn't matter what she said. It didn't matter what evidence was missing. The public had already chosen its villain. Sarah Jo Pender, 22 years old, was about to become a symbol of evil. But the real crime was still to come. Because what happened next in that courtroom would be built not on proof, but on something far more dangerous: the power of a story. Every story has a beginning, but some beginnings hide themselves behind normal moments, the kind that seem harmless at the time. A handshake, a decision, a new address. For Sarah Jo Pender, it was the moment she moved into a small rental house on Michael Street. At first glance, the house looked ordinary. A plain, one-story structure with faded siding and a chain-link fence tucked between other worn-down homes in a quiet Indianapolis neighborhood. It wasn't much, but for Sarah, it was a step toward independence. She was young, working as a secretary, and living with her boyfriend, Richard Hull. To her parents, it seemed like the start of adulthood. To Sarah, it felt like freedom, the kind you chase when you're too young to realize how easily it can disappear. But inside that house, something darker was waiting to grow. Richard Hull was not a man who blended quietly into life. He was in his late 20s, strong, broad-shouldered, with a shaved head and a sharp temper that flickered like static. People described him as both charming and intimidating, the kind of man who could make you laugh one minute and silence a room the next. He'd been to prison before, and he carried it like a badge. Sarah, by contrast, was soft-spoken, polite, and endlessly accommodating. Friends later said she wanted peace more than anything, but peace doesn't last long when it's built on control. When she met Richard, she was drawn to his confidence. That kind of dangerous gravity that makes you feel protected until you realize you're orbiting something destructive. He told her she was special, that she was the only person who understood him. It was the kind of affection that feels intoxicating when you're 21 and still trying to believe in love. But love, when mixed with fear, becomes its own kind of prison. The Michael Street house wasn't just home to Sarah and Richard. It was shared with another couple, Andrew Cataldi and Tricia Nordman, two people running from their own problems. Andrew was a dealer. Tricia was his girlfriend, young, addicted, loyal to the wrong man. They had fled charges in Nevada and landed here, using Michael Street as their temporary hideout. Between the four of them, the house became a strange ecosystem. Part home, part business, part battlefield. There were drugs, there was money, and there were secrets. It wasn't the kind of place where trust could survive for long. Neighbors would later say they sometimes heard shouting late at night, loud enough to echo down the block. Other nights, they'd see the lights on until sunrise, music thumping through the walls. Sometimes the house went silent for days, curtains drawn tight. To outsiders, it was just another rental. To those inside, it was a storm building in slow motion. Sarah worked regular hours at her secretarial job. Every morning she'd leave early, drive to work, and pretend to live a normal life. But every night, she came home to chaos. Richard and Andrew often argued about money, drugs, loyalty. Sometimes Sarah tried to calm them. Sometimes she stayed out of sight, quietly washing dishes or sitting in her room, waiting for the shouting to end. She was trapped in a kind of emotional gravity she couldn't escape. Her love for Richard was real, but so was her fear of him. He controlled the house, the people, the pace of every day. By early October 2000, things were falling apart fast. There were rumors that Andrew had been skimming drug profits, taking more than his share. Tricia was threatening to leave. Richard was angry all the time, paranoid, unpredictable. Sarah told a friend later that she could feel it coming. Something dark, something final. But she didn't know when or how. That last week, the tension was like a live wire. Andrew owed Richard money. Tricia had been talking about going to the police. And Richard, in his usual impulsive way, decided he needed a gun. Because he was a convicted felon, he couldn't buy one himself. So he told Sarah to do it. And she did. That decision, that one small, terrible decision, became the pivot point of her life. They drove to a Walmart on the morning of October 24th. It was bright and unremarkable. Rows of aisles, fluorescent lights, the smell of rubber and cleaning products. The kind of place where the smallest moments of fate can hide behind the ordinary. Richard picked out the weapon, a 12-gauge shotgun. Sarah, still in her work clothes, filled out the paperwork. She paid for it. A cashier would later testify that Richard seemed to know exactly what he wanted, and Sarah just followed his lead. To her, it was routine. She didn't see a weapon of death. She saw a gesture of trust, of compliance, of love. To him, it was a solution waiting to happen. That night, they had dinner with Sarah's parents. They laughed, talked about work, about family. Her mother said later that Sarah seemed distracted, distant. No one could have imagined what would happen within hours. They returned home around 11 p.m. It was a Tuesday night, quiet, cold, and ordinary. And then, sometime before dawn, everything broke apart. What exactly happened inside that house remains uncertain. The few people who knew the truth are either dead or unwilling to talk. But from what we know, an argument erupted between Richard and Andrew. It wasn't the first time, but this time, it didn't end with shouting. Sarah said she stepped outside. She needed air. And when she came back, the silence felt wrong. The kind of silence that means something terrible has already happened. Inside, she found blood. The smell hit first. Sharp, metallic, unmistakable. Then the sight. Bodies, still, unmoving, everything red and still. Andrew Cataldi and Tricia Nordman were dead, shot with the same weapon she had bought that morning. Richard stood there, pale and shaking. Sarah didn't run. She didn't scream. She froze. That's how shock works. It traps you in place, paralyzes reason. Richard told her what to do, and she obeyed. They cleaned. They scrubbed blood off the walls, off the carpet, off the furniture. They loaded the bodies into Richard's truck. They drove through the dark, their headlights the only witnesses. They stopped at a dumpster, a grim, silent stop, and left the bodies there. Then they went home. When the sun rose, Sarah put on her work clothes and went to her job. She smiled at coworkers. She answered phones, all while knowing what lay inside that dumpster just blocks away. Maybe that's the part people never understood, how someone could live normally after something so horrific. But people forget, fear doesn't make sense. Love doesn't make sense. And trauma rewires the brain in ways that logic can't explain. The discovery came the next morning. A sanitation worker spotted something strange in the dumpster. A glimpse of flesh beneath a torn sheet. He called the police. By afternoon, detectives were on Michael Street. The house was half scrubbed, the carpets damp, the smell of bleach heavy in the air. They knew something terrible had happened there. Within 48 hours, Richard Hall was in custody. At first, he denied everything. Then the evidence came. Blood, fibers, witnesses. Finally, he confessed. He told police he had shot both victims. For investigators, that should have been the end. The shooter confessed. The weapon matched. The timeline was clear. But something about the case intrigued them. Maybe it was Sarah's calm demeanor. Maybe it was the fact that she had bought the gun. Maybe it was because people love a story more than they love a fact. And in that moment, they decided she wasn't just part of the tragedy. She was the tragedy. The next few weeks would transform Sarah Jo Pender from a scared young woman into the villain of her own story. Not because of what she did, but because of what others wanted her to be. And as the headlines began to spread, so did the myth. The newspapers didn't call her a victim. They didn't call her a survivor. They called her a manipulator, a young woman who used beauty and intelligence to bend men to her will. A prosecutor called her the female Charles Manson, and that phrase stuck, not because it was true, but because it sold newspapers, filled courtrooms, and satisfied a public hungry for something sensational. The truth was slipping away, and the story, the version everyone wanted to believe, was about to take its place. By the time dawn broke on October 25th, 2000, 2 people were already dead, and a young woman's life was quietly collapsing in the background. The murders on Maple Street had taken only seconds. 2 blasts from a shotgun that echoed once and then disappeared into the night. But the story that followed would last decades. Sarah Jo Pender woke up that morning in a different world. The house she had lived in for months now felt foreign, soaked in silence and fear. The walls that once held laughter and chaos now held secrets too heavy to speak. Richard Hull was pacing the floor, paranoid, muttering. He had already made his choice: to hide, to clean, to cover it up. And in that moment, Sarah made hers. Not to call the police, not to run, but to stay. Later, she would call that choice the stupidest thing I've ever done. But in truth, it wasn't stupidity, it was paralysis. When your world collapses in front of you, your brain doesn't plan. It freezes. And so, in that frozen space, the cover-up began. Richard told her what to do. "Get the cleaner," he said. "Help me move them." She didn't argue. She didn't think. She just obeyed. They dragged the bodies across the floor, leaving long smears of blood that no amount of bleach could truly erase. They rolled the bodies in sheets, loaded them into his pickup truck, and drove into the early morning darkness. There's something haunting about that image. 2 people driving through sleeping neighborhoods, the hum of the engine loud in their ears, carrying death in the back of the truck. No one saw them. No one stopped them. The world was still asleep. They pulled up beside a dumpster, just a few blocks from home. Richard got out first. He was calm. Too calm. Sarah stayed in the passenger seat, hands shaking, heart pounding. He opened the truck bed, grunted, lifted, and pushed. And in that small, brutal moment, 2 human lives disappeared into garbage. When it was done, they drove away. Back at the house, the cleaning began. Bleach, towels, carpet cleaner borrowed from a neighbor. The smell of ammonia and blood mixing in the air. Richard barked orders. Sarah followed them. Every movement mechanical, every breath shallow. They worked until their bodies ached and the floor was raw. But blood has memory. It seeps into cracks and fibers, hides beneath paint, lingers in ways no cleaner can erase. They tried to pretend it never happened. They threw away the sheets, burned their clothes, scrubbed their skin raw. But guilt doesn't wash off. By mid-morning, Sarah left for work. Her hands still trembling, her mind stuck in a nightmare she couldn't wake from. She sat at her desk, answered phones, and typed memos. To her coworkers, she seemed quiet. To herself, she was falling apart. That same morning, miles away, a sanitation worker began his route. It was an ordinary job, the same streets, the same dumpsters, every day. But that morning, something caught his eye. A shape, a color that didn't belong, something pale, beneath a torn blanket. He thought it was a mannequin at first. Then he saw hair. He froze, dropped his clipboard, and called the police. Within hours, the dumpster behind 900 West 16th Street was surrounded by yellow tape. Detectives arrived, followed by crime scene techs, photographers, and news vans. 2 bodies were pulled from the trash. 1 male, 1 female. Both shot. Both wrapped in bedding. Identification came quickly. The victims were Andrew Cataldi and Tricia Nordman, known fugitives. Last known address, a small house on Michael Street. When police knocked on the door, the smell of bleach hit them first. The floor was damp, carpets rolled up, and a half-empty bottle of cleaner sat by the sink. To trained eyes, it was a scene that screamed panic. Sarah and Richard weren't there at first, but within hours, both were brought in for questioning. Richard Hull was calm. Too calm. He told police he didn't know what they were talking about. Then, as detectives pushed, his story began to crumble. Within 2 hours, he confessed. He told them everything. How the argument started, how he shot them both, how he and Sarah cleaned up and dumped the bodies. He admitted it all. But he didn't stop there. He said something else, something that would destroy her life. He said Sarah made him do it. Detectives leaned in. They wanted to believe him. It made the story bigger, cleaner, easier to sell. Hull claimed Sarah was the mastermind. He said she told him to kill them, that she wanted them gone. It was a lie, but it was a useful one. When Sarah was brought into the interrogation room, she was exhausted and terrified. She told them the truth, that Richard had killed them, that she had helped clean up afterward, that she didn't know what else to do. But every word she said only dug her hole deeper. To detectives, her honesty looked like guilt. Her fear looked like calculation, and her silence looked like indifference. They didn't see a young woman in shock. They saw a manipulative accomplice. 4 days after the murders, Richard Hull was officially charged with 2 counts of murder. Sarah was charged too. At first, her charges were expected to be lesser. Assisting a criminal, evidence tampering, maybe accessory after the fact. But then something shifted inside the Marion County Prosecutor's Office. They wanted to make an example. They wanted a headline. And the way to get it was simple. Turn Sarah Jo Pender into the villain. To them, she wasn't a frightened girlfriend anymore. She was the mastermind who orchestrated it all. And once that story was written, it didn't matter what the evidence said. The story was stronger, more dramatic, more convincing. When investigators combed through the house, they found blood evidence, yes, but none of it linked to Sarah. There were no fingerprints on the weapon, no DNA tying her to the shooting itself, nothing that physically placed her at the trigger. But that didn't stop them. The prosecution built its theory piece by piece, not with facts, but with assumptions. They said she was smart, controlling, manipulative. They said she must have known. They said she must have planned it. And slowly, through repetition, speculation became truth. One detective described her as too calm. Another said she showed no remorse. Those words appeared in reports, in court filings, in news stories, and each time they painted her image darker. By the time she was indicted, Sarah Jo Pender wasn't a real person anymore. She was a symbol, the beautiful manipulator, the cold-hearted woman, the female Manson, and it worked. The public was hooked. Meanwhile, Richard Hull sat in jail, rewriting history to save himself. He claimed she wrote him letters from jail, confessing and praising him for his loyalty. The problem? The letters didn't exist, not until someone made them. And when one finally appeared, a handwritten confession, supposedly from Sarah herself, the prosecution seized it like a gift. They didn't question where it came from. They didn't verify its authenticity beyond a shaky handwriting analysis. They just waved it in front of the jury and said, "Here, proof." That letter would become one of the central pieces of evidence that sent her to prison for life, even though years later it would be proven to be completely fake. But in that moment, truth didn't matter. Only the story did. Within weeks, the Michael Street murders became a spectacle. News outlets ran with headlines like "Deadly Love Triangle" and "The Female Charles Manson." Every article focused on her eyes, her looks, her supposed ability to manipulate men. It was character assassination, packaged as journalism. The public devoured it. They didn't see the scared young woman in the back of a police car. They saw the villain they were promised. And when her trial date approached, there was no turning back. Sarah Jo Pender wasn't walking into a courtroom. She was walking into a story that had already been written for her. By late 2001, she was officially charged with 2 counts of murder. The prosecutor's office believed it was an easy win, a sensational case, a sure conviction. But underneath the noise, the lies, and the spectacle, one haunting truth remained. There was still no physical evidence tying Sarah to the murders. Not a fingerprint, not a drop of blood, not a single piece of proof. Only words, stories, and a forged letter that would one day unravel everything. But that unraveling was still years away. For now, the story was winning, and the woman who didn't pull the trigger was about to be punished as if she had. The courtroom has always been a stage. Somewhere between truth and performance, it becomes a place where stories decide fates. And in the summer of 2002, the story of Sarah Jo Pender took center stage. From the moment she stepped into that courtroom, the atmosphere was electric, not with curiosity, but with judgment. The press had already named her. The prosecution had already framed her. And the jury, whether they realized it or not, had already started to believe it. It was July, hot, heavy, tense. Sarah sat at the defense table, a 22-year-old woman with her entire future hanging on the edge of words she didn't say and actions she didn't do. Her parents were in the gallery every day, watching, praying, silently hoping that someone, anyone, would see what they saw, that their daughter was not a killer. But inside that courtroom, reality had already been rewritten. The lead prosecutor was Larry Sells, a veteran, attorney with a reputation for being both charismatic and ruthless. He'd handled dozens of murder cases, and he understood something most juries never realize. People don't just believe evidence. They believe emotion. And emotion was exactly what he was about to deliver. There was no blood linking Sarah to the crime. The manipulator. He told them she had planned everything. That she had whispered to her boyfriend to kill their roommates. That she had lured them into comfort and then into death. He said she was cold, calculated, emotionless. A young woman who saw murder as an opportunity. The words that would haunt her forever came next. He called her the female Charles Manson. The phrase hit the courtroom like an explosion. Reporters scribbled it down instantly. Cameras caught every flicker of reaction. And in that moment, Sarah wasn't a woman anymore. She was a headline. The defense objected. They argued that the phrase was inflammatory, unfair, unrelated. But the damage was done. The jury was already looking at her differently. Not as a confused young woman, but as a symbol of something monstrous. The prosecution's case rested on 2 main pillars, a letter and a witness. Both would later collapse under scrutiny. But in that moment, they were treated as gospel. The first was the now infamous letter, supposedly written by Sarah to Richard Hull while he was in jail. It was handwritten, emotional, and damning. In it, Sarah confessed to killing Andrew and Tricia in a moment of drug-fueled rage. It read, "I wish I could go back and change that night. Drew was so mean I just snapped. I didn't mean to kill them. It must have been the acid. Destroy this letter." It sounded like a confession. It looked like her handwriting. And for a jury, eager for certainty. It was enough. No one questioned where it came from. No one asked how a letter, supposedly written in jail, managed to appear at exactly the right time for the prosecution. No one looked deeper. Years later, we'd learn the truth, that the letter was a forgery, that Richard Hull had another inmate, Steve Logan, copy Sarah's handwriting, that Logan himself would later sign a sworn affidavit saying he was coerced into writing it, saying, "I was manipulated." I didn't realize how much it would destroy her life. But in that courtroom, no one knew that, and the letter, a complete fake, became the prosecution's smoking gun. The second piece of evidence was the testimony of a man named Floyd Pennington, a convicted child molester serving time for multiple offenses. He told the court that Sarah had confessed to him during a medical transfer from prison to a hospital. He claimed they'd fallen in love. He claimed she whispered every detail of the murders to him. It was a dramatic story, too perfect, too cinematic, and that's what made it believable. What the jury never heard was the truth about Pennington, that he had struck a deal with prosecutors, that his 56-year sentence had magically shrunk to 12, that he was released after only 6 years, and most importantly, that he had a snitch list, a literal piece of paper listing inmates he was willing to fabricate testimony about in exchange for leniency. That list was hidden. It wasn't turned over to the defense. It sat in a police file that no one opened until years later. Without it, Pennington looked credible. With it, he looked like what he really was, a liar trading lies for freedom. The defense tried to fight back. They argued that there was no physical evidence, no proof beyond words and assumptions. They pointed out that Richard Hull had already confessed to the murders multiple times. They reminded the jury that Sarah's fingerprints weren't on the gun, that she had turned over key evidence to police, that she had cooperated. They pleaded for reason. But reason doesn't sell stories. Emotion does, and the prosecutor knew it. When Sells delivered his closing argument, it was pure theater. He spoke slowly, confidently, his voice carrying the rhythm of certainty. He told the jury they had a duty to protect society from people like Sarah, people who use others to do their dirty work, people who hide evil behind intelligence and beauty. He pointed at her and said, "She's the one who planned it. She's the one who made it happen. She's the one who deserves to pay." Sarah sat there in silence, hands shaking under the table. Her mother wept quietly in the back row. Every word was a dagger, not just to her reputation, but to her humanity. When the jury retired to deliberate, the courtroom emptied into whispers. Hours passed. Then, just before evening, they returned. The verdict was guilty. 2 counts of murder. Sarah's face went pale. Her lips trembled. She didn't cry, not right away. She just stared forward, as if the world had split in two and she had fallen between the cracks. The judge asked if she had anything to say before sentencing. She stood. Her voice was quiet, shaking. She said, "I didn't kill anyone. I'm sorry I didn't do more to stop what happened, but I am not a murderer." The judge nodded, but didn't look convinced. "You manipulated a man into killing 2 people. For that, you will serve 110 years. Her knees buckled. Her mother screamed. And just like that, it was over. When the metal doors closed behind her, the sound echoed through her head. She was 22. No longer Sarah, no longer free, no longer believed. Just inmate 953968, a number in a system that had no room for doubt. The press called it justice. The headlines read, "Evil genius gets 110 years," and female Charles Manson sentenced to die behind bars. Her name became a warning. Her face became a symbol. But no one printed the truth. No one mentioned that the entire case had been built on two things that would later be proven false. The world moved on. Sarah didn't. Every night, inside her cell, she replayed the same questions in her mind. How did it come to this? How could lies become truth so easily? And how could the people sworn to protect justice be the same ones who destroyed it? Over the years, fragments of doubt began to surface. Quiet at first, then louder. Whispers about the forged letter. Whispers about the deal made with Pennington. Whispers about hidden files. But whispers mean nothing against a conviction. The system had spoken, and the system never likes to admit it's wrong. For Sarah Jo Pender, justice wasn't blind, it was deaf. Deaf to the truth. Deaf to reason. Deaf to the pleas of a woman who was already buried alive in the name of order. Some say justice is a light in the darkness. But in Sarah's story, the light was twisted into a weapon. Every lie became a piece of armor protecting the conviction. Every truth became a shadow too inconvenient to see. Her trial wasn't just a courtroom proceeding, it was a performance. And the audience believed the act. When the doors finally closed and the reporters went home, the headlines had already done their job. Sarah Jo Pender, 22 years old, no physical evidence against her, had become one of America's most infamous murderers. And no one questioned how that happened. Not yet. Because years later, long after the camera stopped rolling and the ink dried, one man would start to question everything. The very man who built the story that destroyed her life. But that part of the story, the one where truth tries to claw its way back, was still waiting to be told. And it would begin not in a courtroom, but in a dusty old file, hidden in the back of a drawer. The first night in prison is a sound you never forget. It isn't the clang of the metal door or the shuffle of keys. It's the silence that comes afterward. When the noise fades and you realize no one is coming for you. Sarah Jo Pender sat on a thin mattress, staring at a gray wall that would be hers for decades. The fluorescent lights hummed. Somewhere down the corridor, someone cried. She pressed her palms against her knees and whispered to herself that she could survive this, that it had to be a mistake that would soon be fixed. But days became weeks, and the world outside moved on without her. To the public, she was already gone. The female Charles Manson, the manipulative mastermind, the killer who used love as a weapon. The papers stopped printing her name after the sentencing. Our story had already done its job. Inside, she became a number, 953968. Every meal the same, every sunrise identical. Her cell, a box that measured the same size as her despair. She wrote letters to her parents every week. She told them not to worry, that she was reading, that she was learning law in the library. But between the lines, her mother could see the truth. The exhaustion, the hopelessness, the quiet guilt for something she didn't do. She began filing appeals on her own, handwritten motions that vanished into legal offices and came back stamped, denied. Each rejection was another invisible sentence piled on top of the first. In prison, time bends. Days blur. People vanish into transfers or into themselves. Sarah learned the rhythm. Count, meal, work detail, count again. The air smelled of bleach and resignation. Every night, the same dream, the sound of the shotgun, even though she never pulled the trigger. Years passed. The world changed outside. New presidents, new phones, new wars. Inside, everything stayed the same. But something inside her refused to die. It was the same stubbornness that had once made her buy a gun for a man she loved. A willingness to believe she could fix the unfixable. Now, she turned that stubbornness toward survival. She studied criminal law. She memorized case numbers. She learned the language of the system that had buried her. Still, every appeal failed. No one cared that the letter had been forged. No one cared that the jailhouse snitch had lied. The system valued closure more than truth. By 2008, 6 years after her conviction, Sarah had been denied enough times to understand the pattern. The courts weren't listening. And so, she made the most desperate decision of her life. She would leave. It started as whispers in the laundry room. A guard named Scott Spittler, friendly, talkative, seemed to believe she'd been wronged. They exchanged words, then notes, then something more dangerous. Trust. He told her he could help. For money, for attention, for the strange thrill of being needed. They planned for months. Each piece tiny. A door left unlatched, a shift swapped, a van parked at the edge of the yard. It shouldn't have worked. But on August 4th, 2008, it did. When morning count finished, Sarah slipped through a service closet, heart hammering so loud she swore the walls could hear it. She ducked into a laundry cart, then into the van. The door slammed. The engine started. And just like that, the woman sentenced to die in prison was gone. Freedom didn't feel like she imagined. It didn't feel triumphant. It felt terrifying. For the first time in 6 years, she breathed air without barbed wire over it, and it made her dizzy. She made her way to Chicago, changed her hair, changed her name, found a small apartment under an alias. She worked odd jobs for cash. She avoided windows, avoided neighbors. Every sound of sirens made her flinch. For 130 days, she lived like a ghost. She told herself she wasn't running from guilt. She was running from injustice. But even ghosts get seen. On December 22nd, 2008, a neighbor recognized her face while watching America's Most Wanted. 2 hours later, the hallway filled with police. She opened the door before they could knock. "I know why you're here," she said. They cuffed her quietly. Back in Indiana, the world reacted exactly as expected. Headlines didn't say, "Desperate woman escapes unjust sentence." They said, "Murderess on the run." Her escape wasn't proof of desperation. It was treated as proof of guilt. Prison was waiting for her, colder than before. This time there were no cellmates, no library, just solitary confinement. A concrete room the size of a closet, a metal bunk, and silence thick enough to crush thought. For nearly 6 years, that silence was her only companion. She learned every sound the building made, the hiss of pipes, the click of guards' boots, the echo of keys. Sometimes she spoke aloud, just to remind herself she still had a voice. Sometimes she wrote on the wall with a dull pencil, little messages only she could read. "I am still here." People who have never been alone that long can't understand what it does to the mind. Days stretch, dreams turn into hallucinations, time dissolves. It's not punishment, it's erasure. And yet, somehow, she held on. Outside those walls, the world was changing again. True crime documentaries were finding new audiences. Wrongful conviction stories were being told on podcasts and streaming platforms. But Sarah's name had faded. She wasn't an active headline anymore. She was a cautionary tale that people had forgotten. Inside her isolation cell, she decided that if no one else would tell her story, she would. She began writing letters, essays, notes for a book she might never finish. She wrote about the danger of believing narratives over evidence. She wrote about how quickly love could turn to fear, and fear to tragedy. She wrote about forgiveness, even for the man who had pulled the trigger. Her words leaked out through friends and family, small pieces shared online. And slowly, very slowly, people began to remember her name again. But remembering isn't the same as believing. Most still saw her as the woman who escaped, not the woman who was wrongfully convicted. In the eyes of the law, nothing had changed. The forged letter was still considered legitimate evidence. The false testimony was still part of the record. And Sarah Jo Pender was still serving a sentence longer than most lifetimes. In her final years in solitary, something shifted. Not in the system, but in her. She stopped begging for forgiveness from a world that didn't want to forgive. Instead, she focused on something quieter. Acceptance without surrender. She meditated. She read philosophy. She wrote that forgiveness wasn't about excusing the people who lied. It was about freeing herself from needing their approval. She began to believe that the only freedom left to her was internal. And somehow, that belief kept her alive. By 2014, she was finally released from solitary, back into the general population. When she walked into the light of the main yard, women stared. Some whispered her name like she was a legend. Others simply nodded, as if to say, "You made it." But survival wasn't victory. Outside, her parents had aged. Her friends had scattered. The world she once knew no longer existed. Yet even then, even after years of silence, the truth was beginning to stir in places she couldn't see. Inside old evidence boxes. Inside the conscience of one man who had once stood across the courtroom from her. He was about to reopen the case, not to prosecute, but to atone. And his discovery would change everything. Time moves differently for the guilty and the innocent. For the guilty, years are penance. For the innocent, they're proof that no one is listening. By the late 2000s, Sarah Jo Pender had been in prison long enough for her story to fade from the news. But somewhere, far from those concrete walls, a man who once swore she was a murderer couldn't make peace with what he'd done. Larry Sells had been a prosecutor for most of his life. He had built a career on certainty, on standing in front of juries and promising them the truth. But truth has a way of haunting the people who misuse it. He was retired now, living a quieter life, teaching seminars, helping authors write about old cases. One afternoon, in 2009, while organizing files for a book project, he opened a worn cardboard box labeled State v. Ender. The smell of paper and dust filled the air. He thought it would be just another review, a chance to reflect on a successful prosecution. Instead, it became the beginning of his reckoning. Inside that box, he found a document he'd never seen before. 2 pages, faded handwriting. A heading that read, "Potential Witness List, Pennington." He read the first lines and froze. It wasn't a witness list. It was a snitch list, a handwritten inventory of names and promises by Floyd Pennington, the jailhouse informant who had testified that Sarah confessed to him. Next to each name were notes like, "Can provide details" and "Will testify if needed." At the bottom was a single sentence, in exchange for sentence reduction. Larry Sells set the paper down and felt the weight of the years press on him. This was evidence that had never been given to the defense. Evidence that would have torn the prosecution's case apart. Under Brady v. Maryland, it was exactly the kind of exculpatory material that prosecutors are legally obligated to share. He whispered to himself, "How did I never see this?" The answer was both simple and devastating. Because no one wanted him to. He began rereading everything. The transcripts, the affidavits, the confession letter, and the more he read, the less sense it made. The handwriting analysis in the letter was weak, barely qualified as expert testimony. The state's witness, Pennington, had lied about his criminal record, and Richard Hull, the admitted shooter, had confessed multiple times that Sarah never planned anything. Piece by piece, the foundation of the case collapsed. Larry Sells called an old detective who'd warped the investigation. The man sighed through the phone. "Larry, that case was a mess from day one. We just wanted it closed. He was the one who was supposed to prove it, and he never truly did." He started writing letters to colleagues, to journalists, even to Sarah's appellate lawyers. He told them what he'd found. He said she hadn't received a fair trial, that he was willing to testify to it. Most people ignored him. Some thought it was guilt talking. But guilt, when it's real, doesn't care who listens. In 2013, he finally went public. He gave interviews, admitting that Sarah's conviction was, in his words, built on a tangle of lies. He described a forged letter. He described Pennington's hidden deal, and he said the thing that no prosecutor ever wants to say: "I don't think she's guilty of murder." The media latched on to the confession, not with outrage, but disbelief. How could the same man who called her a monster now defend her? But Sells wasn't chasing headlines. He was chasing absolution. He said he owed her the truth he denied her years ago. When news of his reversal reached Sarah inside prison, she didn't celebrate. She sat on her bunk for a long time, staring at the letter her lawyer handed her. Part of her wanted to be angry that it had taken him so long. Another part of her wanted to cry. Instead, she whispered, "Finally." For the first time in more than a decade, someone with authority was saying what she'd been screaming into the void. The trial had been unfair, the evidence false, the system broken. Her attorneys filed new appeals, armed with the prosecutor's statement, the forged letter affidavits, and Pennington's snitch list. The package was thick with proof that her conviction was unsound. But in the world of post-conviction relief, proof isn't always enough. Courts care about timing, not truth. Judges acknowledged the new evidence, then dismissed it as procedurally barred. Too late, they said. Too long ago. The law, it seemed, had an expiration date on justice. Larry Sells kept pushing. He spoke at conferences about ethical responsibility, telling other lawyers that certainty can be the most dangerous weapon in a courtroom. He met with Innocence Project advocates, trying to get Sarah's case on their radar. He said he wasn't asking for sympathy, only fairness. In one interview, he looked straight into the camera and said, "Sarah Jo Pender didn't get a fair trial, and that's on me. The evidence we had was wrong. The system failed her, and I helped it fail." For a man who once built a reputation on convictions, it was the bravest thing he'd ever done. Outside the legal world, the tide was slowly turning. Documentaries started revisiting her case. Podcasts replayed the trial audio, pausing to question every contradiction. Sarah's name began appearing again, not as a villain, but as a warning. Still, the courts remained silent. Each petition came back stamped with the same word, denied. Larry Sells visited her once. They sat across from each other at a small metal table, a pane of glass between them. For a moment, neither spoke. He looked older now, his once confident eyes tired. She asked him softly, "Why now?" He said, "Because I finally stopped believing my own story." When he left that day, he told reporters, "She's been in there long enough, she deserves a new trial." But the system that had given him so much power once gave him none now. A prosecutor's remorse doesn't overturn a verdict. It only adds another layer of tragedy to a case already drowning in it. And so, even with truth on her side, stayed behind bars, her appeals exhausted, her hope thinner but still alive, because now, for the first time, she wasn't fighting alone. The same voice that had condemned her was standing beside her. And though the walls hadn't fallen yet, the cracks were spreading. The story that destroyed her life was finally being challenged, not by strangers, but by the man who had told it. Time doesn't heal in prison. It calcifies. It turns memory into stone and truth into something that only lives in whispers. By the mid-2010s, Sarah Jo Pender had been behind bars for more than a decade. She'd survived solitary confinement. She'd lived through betrayal, falsehood, and the kind of silence that eats away at the soul. But she was still alive, and still fighting. And outside those concrete walls, her story had started to move again. Not in the courts, not yet, but in the minds of people who believed that justice should mean something more than a conviction. Her case had become a study in failure. Law schools dissected it. True crime podcasts analyzed it. Documentaries compared it to other wrongful convictions. Christine Bunch, who spent 17 years in prison for a fire that wasn't arson. Amanda Knox, wrongly painted as a manipulative killer by tabloids. And Rogel Aguilera Medeiros, the truck driver, sentenced to 110 years for an accident that wasn't a crime. Everywhere, the same question lingered. How could a system designed for truth become so addicted to punishment that it refused to admit when it was wrong? Inside the Indiana women's prison, Sarah watched the world change through a small television. She saw politicians promise reform. She saw movements rise for the wrongfully convicted. She saw documentaries spark outrage for people she'd never met. But her own name never made the breaking news banners. Her file remained closed, her sentence untouched. She wrote endlessly to journalists, to Innocence Projects, to anyone who might care. Some letters came back, most didn't. Yet even rejection can't kill conviction. Not when you've already lost everything else. Her legal team filed another round of petitions, armed with new affidavits. From Richard Hull, who admitted the confession letter was fake. From Steve Logan, the inmate who forged it. From Larry Sells, the man who'd once called her the female Charles Manson, and now swore she'd been denied justice. They brought it all forward, the snitch list, the recanted testimonies, the confession that wasn't hers. But the answer came back the same as before. Denied, procedurally barred, evidence insufficient to alter outcome. Those words have crushed more innocent people than any prison door ever could. Because they don't just mean no. They mean we don't care. To the system, Sarah's case was old news, already settled, already finished. But to her, it was still happening every day. Every morning, she woke up in her cell. It was October 24th, 2000, all over again. Still, she kept fighting. She wrote essays about the power of narrative, about how the wrong story told by the right voice can destroy a life. She mentored other inmates, helping them write appeals. She taught herself meditation. She stopped waiting for justice to arrive and started building her own peace from what little she had left. She once wrote, "They can control my body, but not my mind. If I can think freely, I'm already more free than they want me to be." It was the kind of defiance that doesn't roar. It whispers, and it survives. Meanwhile, outside those walls, her case started gaining quiet momentum again. A Georgetown University course called Making an Exoneree took on her story. Law students dug through her trial transcripts, analyzed evidence, and published their findings. Their conclusion was devastating but simple. There was no physical evidence linking Sarah Jo Pender to murder. Even Larry Sells, her former prosecutor, became one of her most consistent advocates. He appeared on interviews and panels, repeating the same words over and over, like a confession he couldn't stop making. She didn't get a fair trial. She deserves another chance. But the world didn't want nuance. It wanted monsters. And Sarah's story had been too successful, too sensational to undo easily. It's hard to convince people that the villain they've feared for 20 years was actually the victim all along. But every time, the same denial arrived. Cold, typed, final. Her earliest possible release date is April 4th, 2054. Why then, she will be 75 years old. She has already spent more than half her life behind walls for a crime that, at worst, makes her guilty of poor judgment and fear, not murder. When asked once what she would do if she were released, she smiled faintly and said, "I'd like to sit by a window that opens. No grand plans. No revenge. Just a window. Just air that doesn't smell like concrete and disinfectant." Her story isn't just about her. It's about what happens when justice becomes theater, when truth becomes inconvenient, and when stories, the ones told loudest, become stronger than evidence. Because Sarah's case isn't unique. It's a mirror. For every one person like her who gets attention, there are hundreds whose names will never trend, whose innocence will die in silence. The system calls it collateral damage. The rest of us should call it what it is: failure. The man who once prosecuted her says it best. Larry Sells now speaks at law conferences, looking younger lawyers in the eye and warning them about the danger of certainty. He tells them, "We're supposed to seek justice, not wins." The day we forget the difference, someone innocent pays for it. He carries the Pender file everywhere he goes, dog-eared, torn, heavy with regret. Sometimes he reads from it on stage. Sometimes he just holds it. For him, it's a reminder of what power can do when it isn't questioned. For Sarah, it's proof that even in the ruins of a life, the truth can still find a voice. Her fight isn't over. Her appeals continue, quietly, stubbornly, against a system that resists admitting its own mistakes. She's still writing, still teaching, still hoping that one day the right person will open the right file at the right time and see what Larry Sells saw. And if that day ever comes, her story will stand as a warning to every courtroom and every jury that justice isn't about who tells the best story, it's about who tells the truth. In the end, the tragedy of Sarah Jo Pender isn't just what was done to her, it's what it says about us. How easily we trade truth for closure, evidence for entertainment, doubt for drama. She was 22 when a judge told her she would die in prison. Today, she's middle-aged, still behind the same walls, still branded by a lie. The world that condemned her has changed 100 times, but the paper that keeps her locked away hasn't changed at all. Some convictions are built on evidence. Others are built on stories. And sometimes, those stories are so powerful, they become cages. Sarah Jill Pender's cage was made of words. Words she never said. Stories she never wrote. Lies she never lived. And somewhere tonight, in a cell in Indiana, she's still trying to write her own ending. If you've watched this far, you already know this isn't just about one woman. It's about how easily truth can be buried when the wrong story wins. Sarah Jo Pender's life was rewritten by lies. But stories like hers don't end unless people keep telling them. So, if you believe truth still matters, share her story. Talk about it. Because somewhere tonight, another innocent person is sitting in a cell, waiting for someone to care enough to question what they were told. And if we stay silent, then the next story built on lies will belong to someone else. Subscribe if you believe in truth over headlines. Period. And let's keep their stories alive.